I'm Rick Weinzierl. I'm at the University of Illinois, and I'm an extension entomologist who works with fruits and vegetables. I'm on slide 2, and it says the cast of characters for what we're going to do today. We are going to deal with seed and root maggots, cutworms, and flea beetles as the early season pests. Some typical season-long or summer creatures, cabbage worms, cuke beetles, and bean leaf beetle, squash bug, potato leafhopper, Colorado potato beetle. I've got a lot more slides on aphids that I'm actually going to be able to cover today, so we'll skip through a few of those. We'll do corn earworm, tomato fruitworm, and stink bugs, and then we'll talk a bit about what some of the overall insecticides and control methods are. Next slide, which is number 3 on seed and root maggots, and I'm going to deal with 3 different insects here, all of which are flies as adults and maggots in their larval stage. First one is cabbage maggot, and they winter as a pupa. So in the upper right picture, the little football-shaped brown thing in the lower part of the picture. That's the pupal stage, and it's about 1/4 inch long. And as temps begin to warm in the spring, pretty soon, they will emerge as flies, and they'll try to lay their eggs in places where organic matter is high and the soil is nice and moist. And those are then the fields or the sites where you get the most feeding by the maggots on the roots of all the plants in the cabbage family. The next slide on maggot has the same picture in the upper right-hand corner because, in fact, with that resolution, you couldn't tell the difference anyway. They're very, very similar. It also winters in the pupal stage, and it's most damaging to the early planted corn, beans, cabbage family plants also, and to the cucurbits, the vine crops like cucumbers and squash. Also, mostly a problem in the wet weather, soils with high organic matter. And for both cabbage maggot and seedcorn maggot, there are multiple generations a year, but only the first one is usually an issue. Realize that seedcorn maggot will also show up sometimes in onion and cabbage. It's the broad host range species in this group. The other 2 are a bit more narrowly defined. There's really nothing you can do with those except wait a few days and replant. And this insect, like cabbage maggot and onion maggot, will also go to transplant. So sometimes you'll even see damage, as you do in the upper right of the 4 slides on the left of the screen, to transplants in plastic mulch, where it just rained heavily for several days, and there's lots of development. And then the next slide is on onion maggot. Again, very similar life cycle. The biggest difference here is that as you get sequential generations of onion maggot, each generation can still be a problem. So even the summer ones can infest onions. Again, the key thing with onion maggot versus the others is that it will infest all through the season in new plantings. So the biggest thing you do to avoid that is to try to prevent any damage to onion bulbs below ground. So if you do run cultivation through, make sure the cultivators don't nick the bulbs and cause injury that can favor this insect. One little bit of good news for these creatures is all of them are infected by a fungus disease, and that's what you see in the lower left picture. This is onion maggot with a fungus disease that's going to kill the adult fly. You'll see the flies hanging on to plants, upper portions of plants, and just dead. It hasn't prevented them from maturing on a crop, but at least they aren't successfully going to lay eggs to do more damage. So the slide title now is Avoiding Damage from Seed and Root Maggots, and typically the things you want to do is to destroy crop residues as soon as you're done with harvest, and always get rid of cull onions any place in gardens or small plots. To the extent you can, you plant on the best drained soils, you limit the amount of fresh organic matter, which means you wouldn't add manure and plant at the same time. If you plant into cover crops, you want to till those in at least 3 weeks ahead of planting. Plant when soils are as let the soil warm as much as you can before you make these plantings or transplantings. And then finally, yes, the floating row covers and other kinds of breathable row covers that exclude insects do help, but realize that the flies have already laid eggs in the high organic matter soil. The eggs are there before the covers go on, because some of the eggs are laid before planting or transplanting. Right, we're now on the slide that the top line says cutworms, and this is another of the early season pests in general, but there are cutworms that show up all through the season and feed higher up on plants. The one we always talk about in field crops and everything is black cutworm, which is a migrant species, meaning the moths fly up in the spring of the year on weather fronts, and they lay their eggs in places where there is some weedy plant growth already. They don't winter here well, but some other cutworm species do. Some of those have laid their eggs in the soil in the fall, and the larvae are waiting in the soil in the spring. They feed on organic matter, and then they also then feed on seedlings or transplants when they're put in the garden. They cut plants, like the middle picture on the right side or the middle picture on the bottom. But they'll also feed on things like the taproot of a radish or a rutabaga or something like that. And some of them later in the season are species that actually feed up on the foliage or the fruit of plants, like the one that's fed through and left a hole in the tomato in the lower right. So all of those are different kinds of cutworms. Not all of them are the ones that are cutting plants at just the base of the stem. In general, tillage in between fall harvest and spring planting helps with reducing cutworm numbers. Weed control prior to planting so that the black cutworm moths aren't laying their eggs in the weedy garden. You maybe spade that up or don't till a lot and make transplants. Those larvae are then going to be waiting in the soil. And the other things you can do that are cultural is to put barriers around plants. Typically you want a hollow cardboard or plastic cylinder that you can put into the ground with at least 2 or 3 inches below ground and at least 2 or 3 inches above ground. You can do the same thing with aluminum foil around transplants before you put the mound of soil back up around them, and those are barriers to the ones that cut plants. Obviously that's a small-scale solution, but for many gardeners it's practical. You can use some typical insecticides like carbaryl, which is 7. Permethrin and cyfluthrin are pyrethroid insecticides. They're sold under a whole lot of names. Bayer Vegetable Garden Insect Control contains cyfluthrin. Spectracide 8 contains permethrin. There are lots of other ones out there as well. The BP products, Bacillus thuringiensis, the organic approved insecticides that contain toxins and spores from that bacterium that kill just caterpillars, will work against the foliage feeding ones late in the season, but they really are not effective against the ones that cut plants early in the year. So although they do kill caterpillars, they really just don't work in that situation. We move to the slide on flea beetles, and there are several different species. Again, early season pests, some of which hang around for the whole year. These are little tiny beetles with hind legs that are modified for jumping like fleas do, so they're called flea beetles, but they do have wings and they are able to fly. There are different species that feed on the tomato family plants, some feed on cabbage family plants, some feed on sweet corn, and there are different species for each of those crop groups. In all cases, these overwinter as adults, meaning they pass the winter in the adult stage, and they move into fields soon after planting or transplanting. In most crops, you would say, I need to treat for these or do something about them if there are enough beetles on plants that they seem to be stunting the growth of seedlings. Or if you're growing things like collard greens or turnip greens, mustard greens, you would say I need to control these if they're feeding enough on the foliage that it's not appealing to me to eat anymore because the insects have already started to do that themselves. So those are your criteria for most home gardeners. flea beetles on the cabbage family plants there are 2 or 3 different species. Populations are usually greatest in weedy fields, and when you move to the crucifer greens, mustard greens, turnip greens, etc., they tend to like the smooth-leaved greens more than the crinkly and curly ones. You can try to intercrop these with tomatoes. You'll still get some beetles. They just don't find the plants quite as easily. And you can, as soon as you plant seeds or transplants, put row covers over them to keep the beetles out. If you use insecticides, the carbaryl or pyrethroid ones work. If you're an organic grower, pyrethrins will kill the ones that are there. And rotenone, although it's no longer approved in certified organic production, is another of the old plant-derived insecticides instead of a synthetic one. In potatoes, tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants, it's a different group of flea beetles. They still overwinter as adults, and they move to the plants early in the year. And typically, you'd say, for anything except eggplant, if they aren't eating more than about 30% of the foliage on leaves, or they aren't stunting the growth of seedlings, you probably don't need to control them. But the one on eggplant tends to really concentrate on it, and you get a lot of damage on foliage of eggplant from flea beetles. So it's often a crop that you need flea beetle control. Same kinds of insecticides and approaches. And then a different one in this group is corn flea beetle. And the corn flea beetles winter as adults, but not only do they pass the winter, they hold the bacterium that causes Stewart's wilt. It's a bit like bacterial wilt of cucumbers, which we get to later, but it's one where the beetles, when they feed on the plants, transmit the bacterium. If they transmit it to seedlings, you pretty much get no yield from those plants. The best way to deal with this is to plant sweet corn varieties or hybrids that are resistant to Stewart's wilt, and any supplier of seeds ought to be able to tell you that information. You can also use sprays on seedlings to kill beetles. Typically, if you find more than 5 or 6 beetles per 100 plants, you're going to find a bit of yield loss from Stewart's wilt early in the season if you've got a susceptible variety or hybrid. Overall, corn flea beetle numbers are down a bit throughout the state because there's an awful lot of use of a seed treatment insecticide in field corn that really reduces early season populations. On the other hand, this is a beetle that needs slightly warm winters to thrive, so we usually say it's going to be more of a problem in southern Illinois than in the north. That'll be true this year too, but we probably will see a greater flea beetle survival for corn flea beetle this year than we do many years. If we move to some of the summer creatures, which start in early spring as well, but persist through the summer as pests, 3 of them are the worms on cabbage. These are sometimes called the cabbage Leps for Lepidoptera. The first one that shows up is imported cabbage worm, and in a little bit you'll begin to see these white cabbage butterflies around cabbage fields and elsewhere. They lay eggs that give rise to a fuzzy green, really pretty caterpillar, as long as it isn't eating all the foliage on your cabbage family plants. Then it's not quite so pretty. It winters in the pupal stage or a chrysalis, so I've moved to the text slide on imported cabbage worm. And the adults emerge from that chrysalis as the first butterflies we see each spring. The larvae get to be about an inch long as caterpillars, and it takes about a month's time for them to go from eggs of one generation to newly laid eggs from the next. So we get 4 or 5 generations a year. This is the easiest of all of the cabbage caterpillars to kill. The BT insecticides, Bacillus thuringiensis, and the ones that contain spinosad, and Entrust is an organic certified version of that, are really, really effective. So it's easy to control, but it's the first one to show up. The next one we often see is Diamondback Moth, and this moth in the left-hand picture is about a little over ½ inch long when it's an adult, so it's a tiny moth. And the larvae are even less than ½ inch long when they're fully grown. But where there are a lot of them, they'll do a lot of defoliation on the cabbage family plants. Again, it winters as an adult, and this is one that doesn't really so much migrate in high numbers, although it can move in on weather fronts. We often accidentally bring them in on transplants, many of which are grown in southern states. They may be infested with tiny larvae. Those plants are brought here, and so are the larvae, and we start new populations each year that way, as well as by means of the overwintering adults. They have a 3 or 4 week generation time, so there are 4, 5, 6 generations a year. The first generation is often spent on the mustard family weeds that are so common in agriculture around the state. There's lots of problems around the world with resistance to insecticides in this pest, and the pyrethroids are sometimes not effective because of that. For most home gardeners, the best approach is to use the BT or the spinosad products, and they tend to work really well. And the last of the group is the biggest one. This is Cabbage Looper. The moth is a little over an inch wide for wingspan, and the larva is a bit over an inch, close to 1.5 inches long, 1.25 inches anyway when it's mature. This one doesn't winter well here at all, but it's one that does migrate into the region on weather fronts. And in fact, lots of insects do that. They rise up into the air as moths or as in other groups of insects as adults, and they fly a little and ride the air currents a lot until they drop out with a weather front someplace. 3 or 4 generations a year here. This is the hardest one to control with BT. If you really had to grow a lot of cabbage and keep all of it clean, you might use one of the pyrethroids. Again, permethrin is spectricide 8, and cyfluthrin is Bayer vegetable insect control. But for a lot of homeowners, still the BT and Trust products are just fine. You aren't usually dealing with the same cosmetic standards or criteria that commercial growers are. And these are thresholds, meaning the numbers you'd expect to see present before you'd treat in a commercial field. And I don't show you this because I think these are the numbers that you should use in a garden, but it does point out that you never get rid of all of these things. If you do, you're going to spray more than you want to and hassle with things more than you want to. So from transplant to heading in broccoli and cauliflower, and between transplant and cupping in cabbage, if you find a few plants with a worm or two on them, leave them alone. There are lots of natural enemies out there that will kill these insects. So don't figure you have to kill every worm in the cabbage family plants to get a crop from your garden. You can use row covers right after planting or transplanting to keep the moths out. The BT and spinosad products work for most people. And realize that the BT and the spinosad products don't kill the natural enemies of these insects. The pictures in the upper right show sort of the remnants of a cabbage worm larva with all sorts of pupae of a parasitic wasp. And what's going to come from them is the wasp in the upper left picture. And what it does is lays an egg inside the caterpillar. The egg undergoes a series of twinning-like divisions, so that instead of having twins or quadruplets or octuplets, it has sometimes as many as 64 ooplets, however you say that. You get an awful lot of individuals from a single egg. And so all those little cocoons are the result of larvae that developed inside that cabbage looper. So you want to not kill these creatures because they help control the pests. Let's move to one of everybody's favorite garden insects, or a pair of them, striped and spotted cucumber beetles. These also winter in the adult stage, and like the corn flea beetle, they carry a bacterium that causes disease in plants, and it causes bacterial wilt in cucumbers and muskmelons. So if you look at that lower left picture, One morning the plants look fine. In the evening they look a little wilted. The next morning they look sort of okay again because it's been dark and they didn't need a lot of transpiration to keep the leaves turgid. But that second night they're all crispy. And the reason is that the disease, the pathogen, this bacterium, has clogged up the vascular system and it kills plants. The beetles have 1 or 2 generations a year, 2 always in the south, sometimes 2 in the north. And to control them, you can use row covers early until you have to have pollination. But after that, if you want to prevent the disease transmission, you do use some kind of an insecticide. In muskmelons and cucumbers in commercial fields, people will say, we need to control this if there's more than 1 per plant because a high enough percentage of those beetles will be carrying the pathogen that they're actually causing significant loss and wilt. In watermelons and squash, they say, oh, we can tolerate a lot more insects because they aren't very susceptible at all to wilt. So you have an idea that it doesn't take many cucumber beetles on cucumbers early in the season to carry the disease that causes some vine loss. What can you do to control them? As soon as you're finished harvesting plants, or as soon as a plant wilts and goes down, get it out of the garden or till in the crop after you're done, because the more you allow insects to feed on it, the more of them overwinter, and the more likely it is that some new ones will come in and pick up that pathogen from the diseased plants. You can use row covers, but you got to get them off to let the bees pollinate. And then you can use the pyrethroids or 7 carbaryl if you're a homeowner. You can use pyrethrins or rotenone if you'd rather not use synthetic materials. And in all of these, it's the best case or the best choice to use a liquid formulation that doesn't leave any powdery residue. So don't use a wettable powder or a dust, because if you spray when the blossoms are closed and the bees aren't there and you use a liquid product, you don't get much subsequent bee kill. If you use the powders or dusts and the bees are present, you will get more bee kill. All right, we switched to a slide that says striped cucumber beetles versus western corn rootworms. These insects are different species entirely. They look a lot alike. If you look at that striped cucumber beetle on the left side, the stripes are very distinct. The edges are really, really definite. And if you flip that insect over and look on its underside, it's going to be black. It's going to feed on the leaves and stems and fruit of all the cucurbit family plants. And this one does carry the bacterial wilt pathogen. It's the one that shows up in April and May. The one on the right is western corn rootworm beetle. It's in the same family, the same group of genera, but it's not the same creature. The stripes are blurry on the adults, and they don't go all the way to the end of the abdomen or the end of the wings that cover the abdomen. And if you turn it upside down, it's yellow or tan. It feeds primarily on pollen, and most importantly, it doesn't carry that bacterial wilt pathogen. So it's not quite so important. It also is the one that shows up first in July, not in late spring and early summer. The other creature in this group that gets confused a bit with the spotted cucumber beetle is bean leaf beetle. And if you look back at the slides later, or you get a copy of the slides from the host at each of your locations, the spots on this are different. There aren't 12 distinct spots like there are on the spotted cucumber beetle. Instead, you may have a bunch of spots and stripes. You may have none of those. They may be greenish or tannish, or they may be reddish. The one thing they always have is the black V-shaped mark right behind the head. That's the distinctive mark. They winter as adults. They'll come out and feed on soybeans, green beans, and for that matter, lots of other plants. There's 2 generations a year, and especially that later generation will cause damage to pods of green beans like you see in the lower right. And yes, you can keep them off of plants with row covers, but typically we don't keep the row covers on plants quite that long, so you might use insecticides if they're causing enough damage to the foliage or to pods. let me stop for a second and say, do you have any quick questions? Let's go on. Squash bug is another one of those everybody's favorite garden insect, right? Only if you're an entomologist, I guess. This one winters as an adult, like many of the others. It's going to become active a little later than most of the other adult wintering insects, and it's going to start to feed typically sometime in June or even early July in the north. It feeds on seedling plants, or feeds on plants, period, lays eggs on leaves, and the immature stages are lighter colored. They're almost whitish at the beginning, and they get darker and larger with each stage. And they feed enough on plants that they remove enough sap that they reduce vigor and yield. Now we've moved to an insect that feeds by way of using a beak-like stylet, like a needle that it uses to suck juice out of plants. So these insects don't leave holes in leaves. They simply insert their beak in and feed on the juices. Again, commercially, people would say, I've got more than one egg mass on a plant. As soon as it hatches, I'll start treating those plants to kill the nymphs, the immature stages. That, again, doesn't mean it's what you have to use as a threshold in a garden, but it does remind you don't have to have plants with absolutely no squash bugs. You just don't want too many. Typically, the sprays you use are going to work the absolute best against the immature stages, so do spray when they're young, not when you see a lot of adults. When you destroy crop residues at the end of the season, you prevent all the nymphs that haven't made it to the adult stage yet from surviving. They're going to die. You can use row covers early, and in home gardens, when you've got 4 or 5 zucchini plants and maybe something else, it is sometimes just as practical to go out and squish the eggs between your thumb and finger as it is to spray the plant. Another insect that feeds with a stylet and sucks juices from plants is potato leafhopper, and this is one that often gets overlooked. Little tiny insect rides the weather fronts up, usually gets here sometime in late May. And the adults and the nymphs that you see in the picture on the top are really tiny. The adult is not quite 1/8 of an inch long. But when it feeds and sticks its stylet into a plant, it also injects some saliva that has a toxin in it that distorts the growth of the plant. And so you'll see the cupped leaves in green beans or the distorted leaves on potatoes. And this symptom is called hopper burn. These same insects feed on potatoes, on green beans, on alfalfa, on apple trees, on redbud trees, on maple trees, and in all cases they cause that leaf distortion. To control them, you might use row covers, or you might use the same insecticides we've talked about before. An insect that rarely or never gets overlooked is Colorado potato beetle. These winter in the adult stage, but they're down in the soil in little cells, and they crawl out, start to feed on leaves. They lay eggs like you see in the lower right. And some of them are resistant to a number of insecticides, some populations. You see the larval stage over on the lower left. We're on the slide that says Colorado potato beetle control on top. Yes, you can put row covers on plants. Yes, at the small scale, you can see these things. Go out and grab them and drop them in a little cup of soapy water, and you got them. There is a BT product out there that's a different kind than everything else that controls the larval stage of these, but you can also use the same insecticides we've talked about before. And although Entrust is mostly a product that kills caterpillars, it does work against Colorado potato beetle. And again, it's one that's certified in organic production. Now, I'm going to do only a few of these slides here on aphids because there are just too many. Aphids are tiny little creatures that are never more than 1/8 of an inch long, except for some of the giant ones on conifers, on the evergreens. They may have wings or be wingless. Their bodies are sort of pear-shaped or droplet-shaped. And many species have these little projections out their back end that are called cornicles. Colors vary a lot. Some are winged, some are wingless. And for you to identify species of aphids is usually not practical. The aphids have lots of natural enemies. So if you look at the picture over on the lower left, the one on top in that group is an adult parasitic wasp coming out of an aphid body. Its parent had laid an egg into the aphid. It developed entirely inside that aphid, and then it comes out as an adult. And you can see the empty ones in the lower left picture. And the picture on the right out of that group in the lower left-hand corner is a syrphid or hoverfly larva, and it's a predator on aphids. You would also see, obviously, a lot of lady beetles that eat aphids. The point here is they have a lot of natural enemies, and you don't have to be the only organism that wants to control them. Aphid life histories are really complex. I'm going to skip through a bit of information here, but some aphids winter on a woody plant and then migrate to an annual plant in the summer and migrate back. Rosy apple aphid and soybean aphid do that. Some migrate in from other regions or spend the winter on plants in the same family that they spend the summer on. Corn leaf aphid migrates, cotton melon aphid, a little bit of both. Turnip aphid spends its winter on some cabbage family plants. All of them have the potential to increase rapidly in population density. And it's because what happens is all the females on those annual plants, or all the aphids on those plants, are females. And they give birth to live young without mating. And the next generation is all females, and they do the same thing. And they have a short generation time, so they build up really, really quickly. And a couple of slides that I'm going to pretty much skip are the ones that say winter and summer hosts for aphids. You can take a look at that if you choose. And the next one that I'm going to skip over says aphids that do not alternate hosts. And my only point here is these little tiny creatures have an awful lot of complex genetic information in them that tells them to do things that we don't always understand all that well. Why the switch in hosts, why and when do they actually reproduce sexually versus give birth to live young? It's sort of fascinating that those little tiny creatures can be so complex. Why do they build up in such high numbers? Here you have in the upper right picture a female aphid giving birth to a live young female aphid, and 7 days later she's going to do the same thing to another generation. If you factor in about 70 to 80 live births per female over 2 weeks, and all of those little females start reproducing a week later, you can understand why they build up so much. Why are they pests? Some have direct impact on plant growth. Some contaminate the crops because their secretion is called honeydew. It's sugary, and you get a growth of sooty mold on it, a mildewish looking material. And you see signs of viruses transmitted by aphids. That's what's in the picture in the slide. So we're going to move to the slide that says direct impact on plant growth. You can see the damage here from cabbage aphid on cabbage. You get the same kind of thing with corn leaf aphid on tassel growth in corn and potato aphid on potatoes and tomatoes. Next slide just shows you a close-up of cabbage aphid and what you have when you see a colony of aphids. You see adults and various stages of young aphids that look a bit like them, and they just get bigger with each molt or each stage. The insects that may be contaminants are, meaning they're on the crop when you harvest it. Think of pea aphids on snow peas or corn leaf aphids all over the husks of sweet corn. Cotton melon aphid can show up on pumpkins at harvest in great numbers. So there are some that show up that way. Here's corn leaf aphid on the tassels of sweet corn. The only reason I put this one in there is if you ever do think you need to control aphids on sweet corn, don't wait until you see them all over a tassel that's already been shedding pollen. Make sure you treat them before pollination, because it's when they're all over that tassel right before it comes out from the whorl that they actually do have an impact on pollen production. In most home gardens, folks, you don't have to deal with this. Lots of natural control of aphids, so that's another reason we don't often spray so much for them in home gardens. Just to show you that they do show lots of different colors, this is potato aphid on tomatoes. So if you see a pink aphid, and you think, geez, I didn't know there were any pink insects out there. There sure are. This is potato aphid on tomatoes. Green peach aphid is the aphid that shows up on lower leaves of things like tomatoes and cabbage and squash and everything. So lots of different aphids. In general, there aren't any great guidelines to say if you see more than this many aphids you spray or less you don't. You usually would say, if I have some aphids on a plant, I might want to know, are there 10 or 15 or 100 or 200, and go back in 2 or 3 days and look at the same leaves and say, are there more or less, and are there lots of natural enemies out there with them? And if there are a lot of natural enemies in a garden, you just let them keep working. You usually don't spray. So you avoid sprays that kill the natural enemies, and 7 and all those pyrethroids that I described earlier are really good at killing aphid natural enemies and not killing aphids. If you're thinking aphids transmit viruses to my crops, and I always have problems with viruses, you're not going to control those by controlling the aphids, because by the time you kill the aphids, the virus transmission has already occurred. So what you usually would do is say, if I've got colonies of aphids that are getting bigger and the natural enemies aren't controlling them, I might use malathion as an aphid control product, or some of the insecticidal soaps, or neem, or oils, the summer oils. Now, when you think of oils, these are just vegetable oils that have an emulsifier in them. They're formulated to be as safe as possible for plants. And once you buy something like Sunspray UFO, ultrafine oil, does it make any difference if it's an oil that's got any of the other secondary compounds from plants in it? Well, yes, if it's rosemary or clove oil, those do work a little better than just a quote, plain horticultural oil. But other than that, the hot pepper oils and the garlic oils, there's no evidence at all that those work better than just plain Sunspray ultrafine oil or any of the other, quote, horticultural oils. Aphids transmit a lot of viruses. I'm on the slide that says transmission of viruses, but I'm going to skip immediately to the one that shows transmission. If you could imagine that the viruses are existing in biennial and perennial hosts outside your garden or your field, and that's where you see the little pink creature and underneath the label that says acquisition. Aphid lands on one of those plants, feeds a little bit, picks up the virus, and then maybe hops up in the wind and moves downwind a few yards into your garden and feeds. The first plant it feeds on, it transmits the virus. The next one, it may still have a little virus, and the next one, it's done. It's lost its virus load. And by the time you kill it, it's already done all the transmitting it's going to do. So the revenge in killing it is really not all that valuable. What you do instead for virus management is use resistant varieties when you can. You use row covers early in the season, because if you prevent virus infection for the first 2 or 3 weeks in a plant's life, you reduce all the impact, or you reduce a lot of the impact of the virus when it does get infected. Reflective mulches slow aphid infestation. Early plantings are usually better than late, but then those are the ones more susceptible to root maggots. Weed management usually helps, but insecticides on those plants won't prevent virus transmission. We'll move to the last of or a few of the last insects we'll cover. Corn earworm is the worm in the tip of the ear of sweet corn. But it's the same insect when we call it tomato fruitworm in tomatoes. Now, this is not tomato hornworm, but tomato fruitworm. It's Helicoverpa zea, scientific name, and the larvae feed on the fruits of lots of different crops. And you see one tunneling into the top of the tomato here. This is the damage that's typical of tomato fruitworm in tomatoes. holes and maybe a little bit of big area eaten on the outside, but it looks a lot different than what we're going to see in a bit for tomato hornworm. All right? This insect winters successfully only in a very few areas in Illinois. So most of the insects we get every year are brought up on weather systems. If you can imagine, that low pressure system off in the west is generating southwesterly winds toward us. That high pressure system in that location is generating southerly winds toward us. And the moths get up in the high level winds. They move until those winds hit a frontal boundary, and it rains water and moths when that happens. So they're coming out in some of the same places where the storm systems occur. So that's how we get them each year. And it works sort of like a little insect pump, as Rick Foster would call it. Commercially, people know when these arrive because they run pheromone traps, traps that use a lure that catches the males, and it tells us these insects have arrived. Some years we get them in much of Illinois by early June. Some years we get them first in mid-August. So you may have to worry about control early, or it may be 2 months later before the first problems ever occur. And for home gardeners, again, you can use pyrethroids that we mentioned before. Permethrin, spectricide 8, cyfluthrin is Bayer vegetable garden insect control. 7 is carbaryl, N-Trust, the spinosad, or you can use some of the BT products. These work to control corn earworm in tomatoes, but not in sweet corn. And you have to say, why would that be? They have to be eaten to kill the insects. They kill only caterpillars. But when you apply them to tomatoes, corn earworm feeds a little bit on the foliage and the outside of fruit. They eat the bacterium and it kills them. That's not going to happen in sweet corn. So let's look at the same insect in sweet corn. The lower left picture shows you the egg laid on a silk. So they lay their eggs on fresh silk, and the larvae then move down the silk channel to tunnel in. Right? And let's go back to that. Pause for that. If you're going to protect sweet corn against corn earworm, the way you do it is by spraying the silks. And you can use the pyrethroids that are in that slide, or you can use N-Trust, but BT won't work. And the reason is that caterpillar hatches from the egg, it crawls down the silks, and it doesn't start to eat until it's inside the husk. And so it never eats that BT insecticide, so it never works to kill it. Tomato hornworm is the other lepidopteran caterpillar that's real common in tomatoes. The larvae you've all seen before. You know, they're as big as your thumb. The damage on tomatoes is in the upper right, and you see the stages in the lower left. This insect is often parasitized in the same way those cabbage worm larvae were. So the picture on the right is a tomato hornworm that when it was much younger, a wasp came along, a little tiny wasp, one that as an adult would fit inside each of those little white cocoons. The wasp laid an egg inside it. The egg divided many, many times into separate embryos, and you get all those individual larvae that have eaten this thing from the inside, and then they crawl out and pupate in the little silken cocoons. When you see those, leave them there, because that's going to produce more parasites that help you the next time around. The pupal stage of this overwinters in the soil. There's just one generation a year, and typically we tell commercial growers that, hey, you can have up to one larva per plant or one larva per 2 plants, and it's not going to cause a problem. The issue is you want to find that larva at that density before it's the 3-inch long larva, because by then it's done all the damage. So if you've got 1 or 2 larvae per plant and they're little and you wait until they all get big, yeah, you're going to see a lot of damage. Again, the parasites often limit populations, and these are really, really susceptible to BT insecticides. And again, if you use BT or spinosad, you kill the pests. The ones you miss, the parasites and predators are still going to live and go after them. So that's why you might use those products. The last group of pests is the stink bugs and plant bugs. And again, we're back to creatures that feed by sticking their beak or stylet into a plant and sucking out juices. All of these are going to feed in that way. It's worth remembering there are lots of different stink bugs and plant bugs out there, 45 different species of stink bugs in Illinois. These are just 3 of the brown ones. There are green ones as well, and the nymphs look a bit, or the immature stage, look a bit like the adult, but they change color as they grow. So there's southern green stink bug on the top and what we would just call common green stink bug on the bottom. And these are the plant bugs. One group is called Lygus bug in the top left. And again, all of these plant bugs and stink bugs feed by sticking their stylet into the plant. So you see in this picture the underside of a tarnished plant bug, and you see that long feeding stylet, and it'll stick it into developing fruits and pods of a variety of different kinds of plants, and it causes distortion around them. Typically, the brown and green stink bugs that show up in gardens become especially numerous when soybeans are harvested or they begin to dry down in all the countryside around us. And these things are still looking for green tissue to feed on, so they move to your garden and they find your green tomatoes, peppers, everything. But they aren't always very easy to see. They feed on the back sides of fruits. If you disturb the plants, they drop to the ground. So sometimes you actually use that to know they're there. And the next slide shows the damage, then I'll show you how you might look for them. But when they feed on tomatoes or peppers or other things where they stick their beak into the plant, it kills the cells around it, and those cells become corky or spongy-like, or that area does, and you get those bad spots. Now, does it make a tomato unedible? No, it doesn't, but those spots are not going to have the texture or flavor that everything else does. So these corky spots are typical of stink bug and plant bug damage on those kinds of crops. In things like tree fruits, where the apple growers or the peach growers are worried about the damage they cause to those fruits, they'll go out with something called a little beating tray, and they hold it underneath a limb and they tap it. Well, you can imagine doing the same thing in your tomato plants to try to know, gee, are there a bunch of stink bugs out there on the backside of the fruit that I don't see? But you don't have to buy a fancy little beating tray from an entomology supply house. Take the lid to a little styrofoam cooler, the small kind, and just hold it under the plants and tap the plants with a stick or your hand and see what falls into that lid of the styrofoam cooler. Works absolutely fine. There aren't any real thresholds, but if you weren't finding any stink bugs and you begin to see a little of this damage and you go out and you find the stink bugs, you know they're going to continue to do that same kind of thing. These are tough to control, and for most gardeners, you have to switch to those pyrethroids. It's really not practical to have row covers on plants at the time these are causing damage because you need the pollination, you're picking fruit. So if you need to control them, the usual thing to do is to use the pyrethroids. Something that helps is to try to reduce the amount of weedy plant growth in a garden, because in addition to feeding on the tomato fruits and the pepper fruits, they also feed on all of the seed pods and flower clusters of the weeds, and so you help reduce numbers by doing that. Finally, we'll do just a bit on row covers and insecticides. These are examples of the floating row covers. You see some on frames, some laid just flat on plants. These are sold under a variety of names. Most garden supply stores have this material on big rolls, and you buy so many linear feet of it, and you can get different widths. And what you want to do is oftentimes support it above plants, although in some cases you can just let it lay loosely atop plants in early stages for the first 2 or 3 weeks to keep out insects. And for that to happen, you have to have all of the edges covered with dirt or somehow sealed up so that the insects don't come in the ends or around the bottoms. These are breathable materials. They don't prevent air or water from moving in. They just don't let insects in. The other things you do in general to reduce insect problems in gardens is, yes, you do till. If you want to do no-till gardening, you often favor some of the creatures like the seed and root maggots, and you may favor the cutworm problems. For some things you plant later, that's going to avoid problems with the seed and root maggots. Some things, the earlier you plant, the better, because after all, we don't want to have these cucumber and squash plants out there real late, because they may get aphid-transmitted viruses in midsummer and then not yield well. So it's a bit of a trade-off. If you plant really early, maybe you use the row covers to keep things out. And in general, weed control in gardens does help reduce numbers of pests, although the weeds do serve as food sources for some beneficial insects as well. So that, again, is a bit of a plus and minus. When you think about the insecticides you would buy as a homeowner, Carbaryl or 7 is usually good against beetles and caterpillars. Right? The liquid formulations are much less likely to kill bees, and they don't work at all against aphids or mites, and they aren't very good against, or the formulations of 7 or Carbaryl are not very good against squash bugs. So don't use the wettable powders where there's any chance you're going to have bees come in and pick up the remnants. The pyrethroids, like the Spectracide 8 and Bayer Vegetable Garden Insect Control, those are going to also be effective against beetles and caterpillars, and they also give you a little bit of good at controlling or killing stink bugs and leafhoppers. They're also toxic to bees, so you use the liquid formulations. You spray when the bees aren't foraging, which is in the hot afternoon or in the evening. And these also are not usually going to control aphids or mites. So what could you use against aphids or mites? The old malathion products are reasonably effective against aphids. Mites, no, they aren't. So if you had to go to mites, you're going to come to some of the things that are in this next slide. And again, folks, I'm on the slide with the title, Insecticides, Microbials, Botanicals, and Organics. The microbial insecticides are derived from insect pathogens. So BT, all these BT products that are Bacillus thuringiensis kerstaki, kill caterpillars. The one unusual one, BT tenebrianus, kills Colorado potato beetle larvae. Nothing else really for us. Neem products come from the extracts of a tropical plant called a neem tree, or Azadirachta. They're somewhat effective against aphids. The rotenone plant-derived insecticide is no longer approved in certified organic production, but it is a plant-derived compound. It's mostly going to kill beetles. That's what it's really useful for. And then there are lots of plant-derived, there are lots of commercial compounds that contain plant-derived pyrethrins. Now, the difference here is these are the natural compounds. The synthetic pyrethroids are a little bit like pyrethrins, but with lots of other elements added to make them more toxic as far as insects go. So the pyrethrins are also mostly beetle killers. Kaolin or surround is a water dispersible clay that leaves a really visible residue on foliage. It's hard to keep suspended in a hand sprayer. It's mostly going to be effective against beetles. And then for aphids and mites, you would choose something like the insecticidal soaps that you can buy. Impede is one, Safer's insecticidal soap, and lots of other trade names. Those are the best things you can use against aphids and mites and leafhoppers. Entrust is this newer microbial product that also works against caterpillars, somewhat the same pest spectrum as BT, plus a few beetles. And this one works without the insects having to eat it, so it does work against corn earworm. And cryolite and cryoside are some abrasive compounds used to control beetles, just as diatomaceous earth is, usually used against the beetles. And last, a reference or two. If you would like some information about common garden insects, This book, Garden Insects of North America by Whitney Cranshaw, is 600 plus pages of descriptions, life cycles, and background information and pictures of garden insects. And at over 600 pages, it still sells for just $30. It's an absolutely wonderful reference, really good for home gardeners. We do a newsletter called the Illinois Fruit and Vegetable News that's largely for commercial growers, but if you were to look at it, you would sort of know what's going on in commercial production, and it tells you the same bugs are out there in home gardens. You just wouldn't use quite the same insecticides and the same approaches that some of the commercial growers do. And I think that's the last of the slides, and I'm at the end of my hour. So you can get to that newsletter using the link that's there, and when you do, you'll see how to subscribe if you actually wanted to get issues of it mailed to you by U.S. mail, but you can also see it for free every time it's posted on the web, and there's information at the beginning of each issue on the web to tell you how you could subscribe if you wanted to get regular notifications. So, that's it, folks. What might I have for any quick questions here?
I was wondering, how does the sprays and insecticides, how does that hurt the earthworms?
Pretty much all the products that I listed for you are going to be foliar sprays. I didn't list any soil insecticides. At the rate you use them as foliar sprays, none of those ought to have any impact on earthworms, because you should have a really, really, really low residue that gets incorporated in soil. So I won't tell you they don't kill natural enemies of other insects up on top of the ground, up on plants, but I don't think any of those pose a risk to earthworms applied in the way you would.
Thank you. One more on root plants like carrots, radishes and stuff. You get those, I don't know, something in there that eats those up under the ground. Is there something you can put in the ground that stops that?
You can use, I don't think there are any home garden formulations left. If any of you are familiar with the old insecticide called diazinon, it was used as a soil insecticide. And to the extent there is any of it still available in garden stores, it can be legally sold and it can be legally used as a soil insecticide, where you sprinkle granules or spray liquid products on the surface of the soil, and then you incorporate them with a rototiller. And those will give some effective control. You have to follow the label for what crops you can use them on, but yes, they can be used in some of those crops. As of a couple of years ago, nobody is making and formulating and distributing diazinon for homeowners. It's been taken off the market. If it's still out there, it's legal to use. And yes, it will have some impact on earthworms. Okay, everyone, I think unless somebody starts with a question here in a moment or so, I'll sign off.